Okay, I know the air condition is a bit temperamental, but it's our last speaker, and then you will have a chance to talk. Wesley Gibbings, very well known to most of us, freelance journalist, newspaper columnist, media trainer. He's published widely, contributed to all kinds of media and on pertinent topics, the rights of the child, climate change, and migration. And he has written extensively on Caribbean media affairs and freedom of expression. He is the founding president of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers and a member of the coordinating committee of the Latin American and Caribbean Alliance of International Freedom of Expression Exchange. And in 2017, he was recognized for his journalism and press freedom activism by the U.S. National Association of Black Journalists and received the organization's Percy Kobuza Foreign Journalist Award. And he's also a poet. The very accomplished Mr. Gibbings, the only non-lawyer in the team.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure about the format for the presentation, so I don't have a written text, and I know how dangerous it is to approach a subject like this without extensive preparation, particularly as it relates to the technical aspects. Now, when Elizabeth called me and asked me about participating in this, I jumped at the idea, and then when she hung up, I hung up the phone. I said, oh my God, what am I getting myself into? And in order to prepare for this, I think that I had to rely on two distinct sets of resources. One was personal and private, and the other one was professional. Personal and private is derived from the fact that my grandfather was one of those guys who made a boat journey from South China to Trinidad and Tobago near to the advent of the Cultural Revolution to team up with a young Afro-French-Antillean Trinidadian whose daughter got married to a man whose grandfather was Scottish, and who, it was said, surprised his wife in the cane field, and she was an East Indian indentured laborer. So I can approach it from that standpoint because I don't think we did very bad. I don't think that we caused too much disruption in this society. I also draw some of this also from my work on freedom of expression and press freedom, because as a member of missions and activities overseas having to do with the suppression of free expression in countries all over the world, I've had the opportunity to look at the situation in Jordan, which is now one of the major recipients of immigrants from the Middle East. I have been to Lebanon, which has now become really a hot spot with respect to receiving Syrian refugees. And I've been throughout Latin America. Only a few weeks ago, I was in Ecuador, where the Venezuelans around us would probably have more than one contact over the recent past. But I approach this as well from a professional standpoint, because why would somebody with an interest in press freedom and freedom of expression also have a very strong interest in refugee rights, immigration? Well, for one, the media and journalists are very much a part of this narrative of the immigrant, both as producers of material and also the object of information that's being disseminated. So when you hear about the 40,000 figure, for example, basic journalism demands that there be some level of verification on these figures. Very similar figure was circulated when it came to the Jamaicans, which I didn't mention in terms of my familiar links there. And if you wanted to, I could spend all evening talking about the problem that Jamaicans have had here. And I have very close association with some of those difficulties. So yes, the media are very much a part of the narrative. If you look at the developments in the United States over the past week or two, you will see that one of the big issues there has to do with access of the media to some of the facilities that are being put in place at these concentration camps for children. And if we don't have the material, the verifiable information as disseminated by journalists, it's going to be very difficult for the people who are activists and the people who have to make judgments, political and otherwise, on that particular situation, would be very difficult for them to arrive to useful conclusions. The second and very strong issue, as I mentioned in passing, but I think it's a very real one, is that freedom of expression is very much a part of the story. It's not only a matter of the expression of journalists and the expression of people who want to write freely about these things. And we know what the situation is like in those countries that are now having people jump off their national ship in a very urgent and very precarious kind of way. But it also has to do with the expression of human beings to be able to state their condition. Can you imagine somebody going to a doctor and being unable to describe exactly what is paining them so that you would be able to address that? Now, of course, if you decide that you're not going to have a conscience, well, all of that that's powerfully, that it makes no difference. But one of the things that you find in countries where people are fleeing because of oppression is that there is this desire by officialdom to have these people both invisible and silent. And that's one of the symptoms that you look at. And I'm sure that in the guidelines and the material that guided the putting together of guidelines for the treatment of immigrants, these are some of the symptoms that you look at in terms of what is the kind of place the people are leaving in order to find a home in your home. And if you see that there is an attempt, a very explicit attempt in particular, to have these people become invisible and silent, you know that you're going to make you're going to make your assessment in a particular kind of way. You're going to look at this as a symptom of something larger. But I'm here as a journalist as well. And there are certain things about the practice of journalism that's very, very important to this equation. One of the resources, professional resources, or some of the professional resources I've had to draw upon in terms of preparing myself psychologically for this. I must say I've become a bit of a crybaby in the past few years looking at some of these situations. Is that more than 10 years ago, my organization, the Association of Caribbean Media Workers, pulled journalists from the region together to talk about humanitarian rights. And the less than hidden agenda really was to get journalists attuned to the human rights issues. The fact that these are quintessential human rights issues. And they extend not only to the more popular civil and political rights, but economic, social, and cultural rights. I think one of the students covered that very well. What is the plight of people? If you look at the Caribbean situation, you'll find that there is a declining inclination to accept people. It was only 2 days ago that Barbados dropped the visa requirement for Haitians. That remains in place with the other 14 CARICOM countries. And even in those countries that have agreed to freedom of movement of people, you find that there are great difficulties in administering a very limited and orderly process through the single market conditions. So you have 10 categories of skills, and people are, through a very orderly process, are entitled to live and work. And do you know what has arisen as one of the stumbling blocks in that whole process? Something that's described as contingent rights, which would be the rights of spouses and the rights of the children. So we looked at this whole thing about movement within our community of people, and somehow or the other it slipped through the cracks that we need to pay attention to children in particular. And as Professor Bella-Antoine mentioned in the introduction, my organization has done some work on media. In fact, there's a publication on the media and the coverage of the rights of the child. There's special attention need to be paid to the children. Because the adults, they're visible and they're very vocal, and you can see them and they could go into the studio and so on. The children are there and they're suffering. So what are some of the things that we can do to improve our coverage of these issues? One, we need to have an internal look. I think that there is a deficiency, a deficit in terms of media coverage of what's happening within our community. And I say our community, I don't mean only Trinidad and Tobago. I've lived and worked throughout the Caribbean, and I have familial Caribbean links, so I don't see home as only Trinidad and Tobago. The Caribbean is my home, and I see this as a space I need to understand much better. But we need to bring that perspective in it. We need to practice more rigorously the journalism of verification. When you hear the 40,000 figure, you need to be able to find where did these figures come from. Is that a gross figure of people who have come in? Is it offset against the people who have left? We need to look at the integrity of the institutional support for immigrants, including the provision of vital services. There's a lot of anecdotal information, and they're worth telling as stories, but the stories need to go a little further than that. And in fact, some of what we've heard this evening provides further for that. The more diligent monitoring of immigration laws. As I said, more than 10 years ago, we assembled in Trinidad and Tobago a group of Caribbean journalists, and we looked at the Convention on Refugees, we looked at the Geneva Conventions, and we looked at other areas of humanitarian rights that Caribbean journalists need to know more about. We need to, as I said, verify the official statistics, and I think that we need to look at the human side in a far more nuanced and sensitive manner, because
to ask questions, brief questions and brief comments.